My name's JoAnne O'Sullivan. I am also an author and work with Goldleaf Literary here in town. And I'm excited to introduce you to Amy, Cherrix, and Bobbie Pyron and tell you a little bit about their work. And then they're going to have a discussion that we can just listen to about urban wildlife, which I'm super excited. These are two incredibly knowledgeable authors. So let me just give you a little background of how this will go. So I'll introduce the authors. They're going to talk amongst themselves, and then you can, whenever you have a question, just type it into the chat. When they've finished talking, I'm going to read them the questions, and they'll answer the questions for you. At any time during this talk, feel free to look in the chat, and you can buy either any of their books that are available. There's going to be a link to their books there. So without further ado, let me introduce our fabulous authors today. First up, Bobbie Pyron. Bobbie is the award-winning author of the middle grade novels A Dog's Way Home, The Dogs of Winter, Lucky Strike, A Pup Called Trouble, Stay, and the teen novel The Ring. So Bobbie's written a lot of books, and animals feature prominently in a lot of these books. Bobbie lives in Mars Hill. She can be reached on Twitter at Bobbie, BOBBIE PYRON with a capital P, if you'd like to follow her after this talk. We have also got Amy Cherrix, who's also from Asheville. She is the author of the award-winning Scientists in the Field series, The Backyard Bearers, Conservation, Habitat Changes, and the Rise of Urban Wildlife, and Eye of the Storm, NASA, Drones, and the Race to Crack the Hurricane Code. Her forthcoming nonfiction book, In the Shadow of the Moon, America, Russia, and the Hidden History of the Space Race, will be published in January of 2021 by HarperCollins. And she's also on Twitter at @Cherrix, CHERRIX. Both of these fabulous authors are members of the Secret Gardeners, a local children's writers group. So I am going to mute myself and let these fabulous, knowledgeable women start their conversation about urban wildlife. Thanks, ladies.
Thanks, JoAnne.
Thank you, JoAnne. We appreciate it. I'll jump in, Bobbie.
Okay.
I am really excited to talk about this topic because I was born and raised in Asheville, and I didn't grow up seeing much urban wildlife. We lived mostly in rural areas when I was growing up, and I only saw, animals that we normally see in our backyard, like squirrels and chipmunks, various kinds of birds. Never saw wild turkeys, certainly never saw, black bears like we do now. And when I moved back in 2014, one of the first things that I discovered from my neighbors was that not only were bears common, they were common in the area where I lived. And I had been living away from Asheville for well over 10 years at the time, and had just no idea that urban wildlife had become such a part of mountain life as it had. And I was really kind of fascinated and scared at first. I didn't know anything about black bears. I grew up here my whole life being around black bears and never knew anything about them except that bears were an animal that you were supposed to be afraid of. And I realized as I started researching that was true and untrue. And that's kind of what spurred me on to write the book, so that I could sort of have an excuse to meet these people that were doing some of this exciting research around our black bears and start to grapple with it for myself and kind of put that in the the larger context of what's happening with how rapidly Asheville is developing and how the landscape is changing, not just here in terms of wildlife penetrating urban and developed spaces, but that's something certainly that's happening all over the world.
Right. And that's interesting that you say that when you were growing up in Asheville, of course, you're just a baby, so that wasn't that long
Hardly,
ago.
but thank you.
But it's interesting that you say that, you didn't see wild turkeys and bears and so forth. Um, and I mean, you know, you walk around Weaverville, of course, living in Mars Hill, Weaverville's a city to us,
Yeah.
but you see, you know, wild turkeys crossing the main street and so
Yeah.
forth. So it's very interesting how that has changed and how
Yeah.
the wildlife adapts to us or
Yeah.
tries to adapt to us as
Yeah.
we just go crashing into um, their natural habitat.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
How were you led to write? Now, your book um, is focuses on another kind of potentially threatening um, type. Well, the perceptions around these animals are complicated.
Yeah.
But will you talk a little bit about what drew you to that subject and what you learned or fascinated you about those animals?
Yeah. So this isn't my earliest book, but the one before this, A Pup Called Trouble, is about a young, very curious coyote from the wilds of the forests of New Jersey that finds himself through a series of events, not unlike Dorothy's as she ends up in the land of Oz. But he ends up in downtown Manhattan. And what made me curious about that, and I think as writers, you know, that's one of the key things is we want to write about what we're curious about, even if it's, you know, both fiction and nonfiction. Um, and at the time, I lived in Park City, Utah, and we had a lot of coyotes around there and moose and so forth. So I was used to having wildlife literally, you know, right in the backyard. But I was fascinated by, you know, I'd read an article in a newspaper about a coyote that they found living in Central Park. And I found myself just wondering, you know, what in the world was a coyote doing in Central Park, number one. And number two, the fiction writer in me started, you know, imagining how would that coyote perceive a place like New York City with all the people and the cars and people picking up their dog's poop in plastic bags and, you know, things like that. You know, so that was really what got me very interested in writing this book.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of a cliche that writers always say that they one of the pieces of writing advice I always got early on when I was thinking about writing was follow your curiosity. And I always thought that sounded so lofty and you know, just more like a platitude than practical advice. But then quite by accident, as I started writing, I figured out that I was naturally doing that anyway. You know, you have to be curious about something if you're going to write about it, because from the moment you conceive of this idea to the moment it's printed, that can be 2 to 3 years of your life, and it's nonstop. That's, you know, you have to be consumed by this, so you better be fascinated by it if you're going to devote that kind of time and energy to it.
Exactly.
And as far as thinking about, you know, coyotes and bears and them being urban animals, there's I did some of my, this is my book, Backyard Bears. And not only do I talk about mostly about Asheville's urban and suburban black bear population, but I also wanted to show kids that this, and many adults as well, because we're all still learning about this, that these situations, these encounters between people in the natural world, whether it's a coyote in Central Park or, you know, a black bear wandering by the police department in downtown Asheville or in your backyard, these kinds of humanized spaces are being reclaimed by animals, not just here in the United States and North America, but all around the world. One of the animals, wild boars in Berlin. There are places that have, you know, problems with animals that I frankly think are a lot scarier than black bears. Black bears evolved as a prey species.
Mountain lions, yeah.
Mountain lions, exactly, like in California, certainly. And black bears evolved as a prey species, so their instinct is to stay away from you. But if your cat trash can is delicious and you're dropping dog food every time you come home from the grocery store and not cleaning up after yourself, and those hummingbird feeders are out and all of those bird feeders are out, bears are lazy and they're opportunistic, and they would just as soon come to your house and eat than stay out in the woods where they have to work really hard to stay fed. And unfortunately, they find a lot of food support in and around here. And I wondered, Bobbie, when you were, because you wrote fiction about an urban animal, and I wrote a nonfiction book.
Right.
And I'm wondering about how you began to research that because we took two different perspectives, but I'm curious about your research methods, because then I would like to know if mine are kind of similar. And Bobbie and I are in the same writers group, but we've never talked about this before. So I'm really excited to hear how you did it.
We're always critiquing, other people's work.
Right.
Yeah, it is interesting because, the thing that I always say to kids when I do a lot of school visits. And the thing that I always say to kids is, even though I'm writing fiction, and it's made up out of my imagination, everything has to be absolutely true. Yeah. And so, I can remember as a kid, I read a lot of fiction, but like My Side of the Mountain, I read this book, and then I went out and made my own fish hook from the description of Sam Gribley making, a fish hook in the book. So it really was impressed upon me that you needed to have a lot of truth. So fortunately, I'm a former librarian, and so research is in my blood. I absolutely love to do research, and I can get down these rabbit holes and never find my way out. So when I'm first thinking about a story idea, before I even have the plot in mind or the voice of the characters or even who the characters are, I start doing my research, because a lot of times that will lead me to flesh out the plot of the book and find the characters, the other characters. Unlike you, I don't necessarily go into the field to do my research. I did a lot of research online, but I found some urban wildlife biologists in Chicago and the San Francisco area, in some of the big metropolitan areas, that I got in touch with and told them what I was doing, because they were studying coyotes as well, urban coyotes. And they gave me some really great insights and information into, how they're finding the different ways through diet, through their sleep patterns and so forth, how coyotes are adapting to living among humans. And, that's the thing, with coyotes and also with crows, and to a certain extent possums, which I also talk about in the book. They are just amazingly adaptable. Like humans are. They are extremely adaptable. And from what I know of the bear stories I hear almost every day in Asheville, so are black bears.
They're supremely, and this is, I always think of that line in Jurassic Park when Jeff Goldblum says, "Life finds a way."
Yeah.
And he's talking about dinosaurs, but it's very true. And I think that, especially in the case of urban coyotes, there is a lot about, and those are Eastern coyotes, right? That you wrote. Well, those are the only ones we have on the East Coast. I wrote in my section of my book about urban animals from other places. I also wrote about Eastern coyotes and what I learned, and you can support me with what you know about this, Bobbie, because I did some research on this, but I just did, very small excerpts about these other animals in my book. My main focus was the bears. Urban coyotes evolved in a pretty miraculous way, as I understand it. And they It was a result of inbreeding when a population of wolves, I think it was in Canada, was so depleted. Yeah. Wasn't it just the population was crashing, right?
Yeah.
That's the way you understood it.
Yeah.
And they started inbreeding these wolves with coyotes, which is extremely rare. And then as this sort of process began, eventually this new breed of coyote, which wildlife biologists call an eastern coyote, also interbred with dogs.
Right.
And so you have this animal now that is part wolf, part coyote, two very successful predators that also have taken on like some of the traits of dogs, which makes them more comfortable around people. And I think, you know, if like I said before, if I had to pick between the kind of urban animals I would like to have to contend with, I think we get pretty lucky with the black bears. If we pay attention and we educate ourselves, we can stay safe and there can be room for everybody. Although we've absolutely way across the line, intruding into their habitats and things. But more than that, and I don't know if this is true with coyotes, I suspect it is, but with black bears, part of it is that we've encroached into their territory, but the other piece is that we have made our living spaces, our neighborhoods and our communities so appealing to black bears that they have become sort of default bear sanctuaries. Because, you know, saying before, life finds a way, and bears like to find the easiest way. And so if we have these beautiful green spaces and, you know, you've got a nice golf course and there's trash cans and there's bird feeders and there's food and there are people who are looking out. One woman said when I was researching the book, you know, we shouldn't feed black bears. They're very capable. They can take care of themselves. That was my big mission for the book. Everyone should be bear wise. Do what you can to help control our urban suburban black bear population. And this woman said, but there's this mother bear and she comes into my yard all the time and she just looks so depressed. I just have to feed her. She just looks so sad. And, you know, we tend to do that as people. You know, we tend to, you know, anthropomorphize or humanize animals in a way that is to their detriment. And the wildlife biologists that I interviewed and worked with for the book, they have a really harsh but true saying, which is a fed bear is a dead bear. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that people are feeding urban coyotes somewhere. That would not surprise me in the least. Did you hear of any instances like that, Bobbie?
Yeah, I mean, you do hear that every now and then, but you know, this was a real interesting thing to me when I was talking with this group of urban naturalists and biologists, wildlife biologists. They had the bright idea. I mean, they had all been talking to each other for years and years, and it's like, oh, you know, look at what oh yeah, they can live in a little hole underneath the shed or underneath the freeway, and they do this. But there was always the assumption that it's almost like an urban legend that mostly what coyotes were eating was garbage, cats, and Yorkies. And you know, so, you know, little dogs.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you know, coyotes, they're going to come and they're going to eat your cats and they're going to eat your little terriers and so forth. And so what they decided to do, these it's like 5 different biologists decided to do, they got the bright idea for a year to collect coyote poop and analyze it to see, well, what exactly are they eating? Let's, you know, yay, let's study poop, which actually I find poop very, very fascinating.
It's revealing, certainly.
It's very revealing. And so what they found after a year was that actually the urban coyotes their diet was extremely similar to wild coyotes. So they were eating things like mice and rabbits and wild grasses and seeds and berries and you know, if they could find them, duck eggs. That's only a very, very small percentage. It was like 1%, less than 1% of their diet was made up of non-wild environment things like trash or you know, a cat. So really their diet was extremely similar to what they would eat in the wild. Not that they hadn't made some very distinct adaptations to living among people.
Mhm.
One being that they became quite nocturnal. And everybody
Mhm.
thinks, well, coyotes are nocturnal. In the wild, they're not, they're diurnal. So they're most
Yeah.
active in the morning and in the late afternoon and
Yeah.
evening. Well, living among people, they have become very, very nocturnal. I mean, sometimes you'll see one in the daytime,
Yeah.
but in the cities, and every city has a large population. They guesstimate that
Yes.
Chicago, the greater Chicago area, has like 4,000 coyotes
Yeah.
living in it. Yeah.
The numbers are astounding.
They are, and some amazing stories. Is one of the biologists who has been studying the Chicago coyotes for many years sent me a clip of a coyote several years ago when Chicago was having a record-breaking heat that summer, and this
Mhm.
coyote just walked into a Quiznos sandwich shop and jumped into the cold case drink. You know, it was the case was open, and he just jumped in, curled up, and went to sleep because you know what? It was hot. So, you know, I had to write about it.
Yeah, I think there's you know, that pull to understand is what always drives me to write something more than anything. That's when it dawned on me that this advice of following your curiosity is really quite excellent advice, as kind of hokey as it sounds. But I've found, especially with, you know, as I started looking at urban black bears and looking at, you know, other places around the world that had, you know, different kinds of intrusive wildlife. You know, Berlin has, you know, as I mentioned before, wild boars. I would much prefer a black bear to a wild boar. They've gored people.
Oh yeah.
And there's all these photographs. One is in my book of these, you know, sort of a sow. And she's got all her little adorable furry piglets around her. It's the cutest thing you've ever seen. And all of these people just standing there, huge groups of people taking photos of this family of wild boars. And it's incredibly dangerous. But they
Oh,
have this false sense of security because they're in this, you know, they're in their sort of what they perceive their, you know, their safe environment, even though they most assuredly were not safe. Especially, you know, mother black bears, everyone knows you should keep away from them. But I think any animal, you know, protects her young.
right.
As far
So,
as, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, you know, when you were researching your book, were there some really cool things about black bears that just took you completely by surprise that you didn't know?
Yeah, one of the things that amazed me most about black bears that contributes to their booming numbers in Western North. I say booming. I need to check with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission to see, you know, where we are in terms of our bear numbers. The population could have leveled off for all I know, but I know when I was researching, it was on the rise. But one of the reasons that is because black bears, once the bears mate, if the female bears have adapted this incredible evolutionary strategy that if their body is not healthy enough to support a pregnancy, their body will just absorb the zygote and she will never become pregnant.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Which absolutely blew my mind. And then the other thing that amazed me so much about them is that they are, to learn that they evolved as a prey species. I mean, I think of a bear as a predator, and that's because just like with sharks and Jaws, every movie that we see of a black bear, the bear's on its hind legs, its claws are up, it's roaring,
Right.
and it looks like a terrifying grizzly. We should be respectful and have a healthy fear of black bears, but they aren't predatory aggressors. They will defend themselves like any, heck, I've been bitten by a dog. I've been bitten by a little feisty terrier that I did
Yeah.
not provoke it at all. And thinking about this massive animal evolving with other animals along the the evolution of the species, that it was preyed upon by other animals, and that makes it instinctively fearful. But we are conditioning these animals to be comfortable, and
right.
that is much more to their detriment than it is to ours.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because, coyotes, one of their biological adaptations, which drives especially Western ranchers absolutely crazy, is when they are under pressure, um, and they're losing space, they're losing territory. If they're being gassed or trapped or whatever, they produce more pups in their litters.
Really?
Yes, rather than less. And it is a
Life finds a
fascinating.
way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you're gonna try and wipe us out. Well, let's
Yeah.
show you.
Yeah.
I mean, that is such
I
a
did not know that. That is fascinating.
yeah. At least with Western coyotes, I don't know if
Yeah.
the same is
Yeah.
true of Eastern.
Yeah.
And they are very different. West or Eastern coyotes are so much bigger than Western. They're just Western coyotes are little scrappy things, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Eastern coyotes are bigger, aren't they?
Eastern coyotes are bigger
Yeah.
because they have that wolf uh,
Yeah.
blood in them. But
Yeah.
when I
They're
was
super predators.
researching A Pup Called Trouble, uh, I because the Wizard of Oz was kind of my almost like my framework for this
Mm-hmm.
story. And so Trouble, the coyote, when he finds himself lost in Manhattan, he needed to have a scarecrow and a cowardly lion to help him, and a
Yeah.
Dorothy. And so what I decided to do was, instead of a scarecrow, I gave him a smart alecky crow named Mischief. And instead of the cowardly lion, I don't know why I thought of this. It just popped into my crazy little brain. I thought, oh, how about a possum? I'll give him a possum for a friend. And I knew, I already knew a lot about coyotes and crows
Yes.
when I was even before I started working on the book, but I didn't know anything really about possums except they seem to have a real knack for getting run over.
Yeah.
And so researching the possums was probably the most interesting and fascinating part for me as far as the research of writing this book.
Yeah.
Now I've become just a huge possum advocate,
Yeah. I've read some about, I didn't write about the possum in my book, but I have been working on another book that's supposed to come out next year that's called Animal Architects. And so I've been sort of researching, where animals live and the kind of homes they build. And so I fell down this possum hole. Well, they don't live in holes. Anyway, I started researching the possum, and I was stunned to hear that they are almost impervious to some kinds of snake venom.
Mm-hmm.
Like badgers, the honey badger famously, can get bitten by the king cobra and survive. And then I've seen a video, and this badger just sort of attacks the snake, the cobra, gets bitten, the honey badger passes out, and then wakes up and just devours the snake. And when I started reading that a possum can kill a rattlesnake. Like it's not that seems absolutely ludicrous to me. I couldn't believe it. I like quadruple checked that source. I was like, there's absolutely no way, immediately to National Geographic to see if it was, and to zoos to see if it was true. But I think this is one reason that I think I'm confident this is one reason we both write for kids. It's that there is so much, specifically write about things in the natural world for children. There is so much to write about that is all around us, that just hides in plain sight, that we never see, you don't have to dig very far to find something absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, I only learned that about the possum a couple of weeks ago, and I've read tons of books about animals, you know,
Yeah.
in the course of trying to write some of my books. And I think that's the thing that, you know, I would most want young readers and parents of young readers to see, is that anything can be fascinating if you look closely enough. You know,
Right.
plants, flowers, any kind of, you know, wildlife, especially in a time when everyone is at home and people, you know, can't, you know, aren't as comfortable going about their lives, and kids are isolated from their classmates. You know, there's a lot of learning to be found in your backyard, in the city and town where you live. You know, we have a ton of wild turkeys in Western North
Oh, yeah.
Carolina.
Yeah.
Never saw a wild turkey. Lived almost my entire life in Western North Carolina. Never saw a wild turkey. Moved to Boston, and they are a public menace, but where they have been known
Really?
to. There's a video of one actually attacking a city bus. Yeah, an MBTA bus being like pecked by this really bossy turkey. There's a very famous turkey that parades up and down Harvard Square. It's this one specific bird. They see it all the time, and you can get on social media and people are like, oh, saw the Harvard Square turkey today. And there's this Harvard Square is a busy intersection in the city of Boston. I mean, Harvard is right there. So if you're driving, you are waiting because there are just throngs of college students coming and going, crossing the street, and this bird is completely nonplussed. I have nearly been attacked by a wild turkey while walking my dog when I lived in Boston. I've been chased by one. I had neighbors who, well-intended as they were feeding their backyard turkeys, and the animals would approach their doors and peck on the door to be fed. So we have to, you know, as much as it's fascinating to be around these animals, we have to always stop and look back, I think, and ask ourselves, you know, yes, it's neat when animals draw near to us, especially if it's an animal that we're fascinated by, or in the case of bears, looks really beautiful and often cuddly. And I would say a coyote puppy, I would be pretty tempted to snuggle one of those too. But not just how are they changing our lives, but how are we changing their lives? And
Right.
what impact is that having on the way the rest of us live? How do we, you know, what happens when our neighborhoods are overrun by these birds, and, you know, the population numbers have to be controlled, you know? Or is it going to be, you know, sometimes hunting laws get changed in order to deal with things like that. And no matter what side of that argument you fall down on, it's a consequence of human beings overstepping.
Right.
I think that is something that, you know, in writing for young readers, as our world is so rapidly changing and so rapidly expanding, showing them that, you know, that's a two-way street, that we're changing their lives in as much as they're changing ours.
Right. And probably in some respects more so, because
Absolutely.
we have taken their native habitat.
Yeah.
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 But a couple more things I want to say, as I said, I've become quite the advocate for possums.
Yeah.
Little cool tips that are trivia facts that I want to tell people about possums, so that maybe they will treat them more kindly. Not only will they eat venomous snakes, or kill them at least, which is a good reason to encourage them to be on your property. They are also immune to rabies. Scientists are finally studying these critters to try and figure out why is it that they are immune to rabies. And the thing that excites me the most about possums, and why I encourage them on my property, is they eat tons of ticks. Ticks are one of their very favorite foods. And as a person who has dealt with a tick-borne illness, was so excited when I read that, you know, your average possum will consume 5,000 ticks in a summer season. And it's like, yay, let's get lots of ticks in my wood, or lots of possums in my woods.
Yeah.
Because, you know, they're kind of a natural deterrent to ticks, and cockroaches and things like that. So all those.
The poor possum. If it just had a fluffier tail,
Well,
I think if
okay,
it
so
was just prettier, it would have
so what's the difference
better
between an
publicity.
opossum and a possum? Do you know what the difference is between?
No.
Okay, so a possum, P-O, without the O in front, is from Australia, and they look quite different than
I had no
the North
idea.
American / Virginian opossum that we have in this country. They do have fluffy tails, and they have fluffier ears, and their coat color is quite different. So they look very different from our native opossums here.
Wow.
But they are North America's only marsupial. Their babies live in their tummies for a long time, and then they crawl out and hitch a ride on mommy's back for a couple of weeks before they go off on their own. But yeah, there is a very distinct difference between possums and opossums. So
I
there
did not
you
know
have
that.
your trivia for the day.
Excellent.
Guys, we have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Oh, good.
First one is for Amy, and you mentioned the field research that you did for backyard bears. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I still can't believe that I got to do this. And as a general rule, if you're thinking about writing a book, but you're wondering if you'll ever be able to have access to the people that can answer your questions, when it comes to scientists, whether it's NASA or field biologists, most of these folks are so eager to get young readers excited about their work and what they're doing. They're also usually hoping for funding, which needs public support in order for them to get access to that money to continue their research. It's amazing the kind of access you have to people. It makes the labor of writing a book so much more bearable when you get to research it with people that are at the top of their field. So I just sort of naively reached out to the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, gave them my credentials, and told them I was writing a book, and that I wanted to interview them about the bears. I thought I'll start with the interview, and then I'll see if maybe they'll let me come out, because of course I had every intention of somehow being able to hold a bear cub. That was just like on my list. And they called me back, and the first thing that Colleen Olfen-Buttle, she is the chief fur bearer biologist for the state of North Carolina. So if it's an animal and it has fur in North Carolina, Colleen is responsible for keeping up to date on that population of animals. And she said, why don't you just come out in the field with us? We're going to go bear trapping, this spring. Just come with us. And I was like, well, careful what you wish for. It's also important to say, I'm not classically outdoorsy. I'm not high. I know we live in a beautiful place, but I'm a bookworm. I like to read and write and, be in here where we are now doing that. Hiking out in the woods, chasing down a black bear seemed like a nice idea in theory, but when I found out I was actually gonna get to do it, I was a little terrified. So I went out with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission wildlife biologists 3 times, and we were able to recapture a bear that was already wearing the radio collar. The Urban Suburban Black Bear Study had previously tagged and collared this bear. And one of the biologists climbed the tree, which was a whole undertaking with rock climbing ropes and everything, so she could climb up there. And she fired a tranquilizer dart into the bear, and the bear immediately shot out. It was living in a hollowed out knot of a tree. The bear shot out, scrambled away. 2 of the biologists went chasing after it because she had the collar on, so they were tracking the signal. So they're like, oh my God, she's on the run. They take off to go get the bear because the bear's going to be anesthetized. So they want to make sure she's safe when she succumbs to that anesthesia. So they go chasing the mother bear, and the first wildlife biologist disappears into the tree den again. And I'm like, what is she doing? And there's photographs of this in the book, which are incredible. The photographer of this book was amazing. A local guy named Steve Atkins, and climbed in there, and she came out with this nylon bag. And we were like, what is with the bag? And she set it on a pulley on one of the ropes that they had already, you know, sort of strung over the tree, and lowered it to the ground. And Colleen opened the bag, and there was a little baby bear cub in there. And all professional pretense just evaporated, and I lost my mind because I was this close to a baby bear cub that was this big, and I was completely beside myself. I have never been so happy. So we
Okay,
gave him
so Amy,
yeah.
I have to interrupt and ask,
Yeah.
did you talk baby talk to the bear cub?
I talked to that bear cub exactly the way I've talked to every puppy, every dog I've ever had. There was nothing, when I tell you professionalism evaporated, I am not exaggerating. I was like, this is the most amazing thing that has ever happened to me. But they had work to do. So I got to hold him while they measured him and everything. They also gave him a microchip. And, you know, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a scientist. I know that's part of their work. That was hard for me. But it's hard for me when my dog gets microchipped. So that part was personally, you know, difficult for me. But I also understood that it was part of their work. And lots of kids have asked me about that, if that part of the work was hard. And I said, you know, this is what field biologists do. This is part of how we keep this population, safe and under control, is by understanding all these things about it. So because they put that little microchip under there, and he didn't even flinch when they did it, by the way. The bear was completely nonplussed. But the way that they, when they injected it under his neck with that microchip, one day if they're out trapping bears again, one of the first things they do is scan to see if they may have previously chipped that bear as when it was a baby. And so if they ever do recapture that bear and they scan it, they'll be able to know that bear is the cub of N057, which was the bear's name, which is not very cuddly, but wildlife biologists don't give them familiar names because they have to keep a professional distance. But it was, like I said, I'm not outdoorsy. I couldn't walk for 2 days after being out with those folks. They hiked it was probably nothing to them, you know, but I was just like, oh my God, their job is so physical and so also really scientific. And I think that's something else that I like to share with kids, that science isn't just something that happens in a lab with, you know, sanitized lab coats and vials and Bunsen burners. It happens out in nature, and it's exciting, and it's important, and it's another way to think about a career in science, or just a way to think about your understanding of the natural world, that there are folks out there that are part, scientist and part, maybe Indiana Jones, trying to figure out, how these animals make their way in the world. It's really exciting.
Can you share, Amy, hold up I know you have backyard bears right there with you. I know those pictures are in there. So while you're looking at that, I will address this next question to Bobbie. What about other wildlife around Asheville, and how do we keep them and ourselves safe? So we've talked a little bit about bears, coyotes. What about, have you encountered, you said there's turkeys in Weaverville. What other animals have you been surprised to encounter in this area?
My husband and I moved here from Utah August will be 2 years ago. And I didn't know what to expect really in terms of wildlife in this area. I was used to, where we lived in the mountains in Park City. I expected to see deer and bunnies, but I was so surprised the first time we saw wild turkeys. Now, up here in Mars Hill and Madison County, the interesting thing is so this is a funny thing about Madison County, which is where Mars Hill is. It's, in terms of square miles, it's one of the largest counties in North Carolina. It only has 6 stoplights in the whole county. So it's quite rural. I think we don't see as many bears here as you guys do down in Buncombe County, and particularly Asheville, because there still is a lot of native habitat. Up here, we tend to see a lot of deer, foxes. We have one of those critter cams that we're on a couple of acres, and we move the critter cam around. My husband has been so disappointed that we haven't seen a bear. I'm fine with that. But we have seen a lot of raccoons, possums, deer, and there's a family of foxes that lives down in our forest. So as long as they leave the possums alone, I'm fine with that. But we don't tend to see the variety of wildlife up here that you guys do down there, and I think it is because it is so rural here. You know, I do know people who have beehives that have to put electric fences around them to keep the bears out up here in Madison County. But that is still a little bit of an exception to the rule. And we have seen them crossing our road, and they're so funny because it looks like a big person in really baggy black pajamas, just sort of glumphing, you know.
Kind of shamble along.
They just crack me up. But anyway, yeah, so that's mostly what we see up here in Madison County is deer and groundhogs. Of course, we see a lot of those. So.
You reminded me, Bobbie, when you said you have a critter cam. There were two things I wanted to tell folks before I forget. If you're interested in learning more about your urban wildlife or participating, I'm not sure if this is where your critter cam came from, but the North Carolina State University has a program called Candid Critters. I'm not sure how this is going during the pandemic, if it's still up and running, but they will send you for free a camera to mount somewhere around your dwelling and record footage, and then you can report back to them. So that's a way that they can monitor animal populations in and around, all over North Carolina. It's North Carolina State University. It's called Candid Critters. And the other recommendation I was going to make is for an amazing website, and they have a social media presence as well, called iNaturalist. We're in Asheville. Everybody may already know about this thing, but folks go out and take pictures of all kinds of things, birds, plants, animals, and they post them to iNaturalist. And iNaturalist can, they can use this data to understand how animal, insect, and plant populations are changing and evolving, which is a way cool. Both of these are cool ways for folks to be citizen scientists, especially if you have young ones at home and you want to get them excited and out of the house, since we're all kind of sequestered right now. But I did pick a few pictures out of the book. I'm going to try holding them up. We'll see how this goes. Take the cover off there. This is a picture of the bear just after Jen Strules, the wildlife biologist, has darted it. And do you see the bear coming out of the knot in the tree there? Yeah, that was pretty incredible. She came out and scrambled backwards down that tree in about 5 seconds, and I almost had a heart attack. It was all over so fast. They kept telling me that I wasn't in any danger and that the bears would instinctively flee. And I'm like, really? Are you sure? Okay. I'm going to trust y'all because it's too late now. I'm already here. Here's the bear kind of coming out a little quicker there. There she is. She looked right at Jen, but Jen averted her eyes because in the natural world, making eye contact with an animal is a sign of aggression, and she was pretty close, so she didn't want to seem aggressive at all. Here's the bag coming down out of the knot in the tree with the little surprise in it. And here is that little guy. There's that adorable little, I know, you can't, when I tell you, all professionalism evaporated. I can't stress that enough. And one more photo, because in case you didn't believe that I got to snuggle that cub, here I am holding that little guy while Colleen measures his paws, which were adorable and like kitten claws. And he was constantly scrambling, trying to snuggle into my jacket. And I really wanted to take him home, but I resisted. I didn't think they would let me get away with that anyway. But we returned the cub to his mom after she had had her whole physical exam as well. And because we couldn't, hoist a 220-pound black bear back into her tree den, we put her on this sling that they had brought with them. It was this, like a big tarp with handles. And the 6 of us that were out in the field carried her 2 steps at a time, stop and rest, 2 steps, stop and rest. over to a place where a tree had sort of fallen over, and we put laurel branches all around it and made her a den. And they set up a wildlife camera and they monitored her, and she woke up, and when she did, she and her cub stayed there. So I guess we did a pretty decent job of building her den, although I bet her tree was a little cozier. I hope she went back to it. But her tree, by the way, was in the backyard of a housing development up on Town Mountain. And it was, this very lovely man had this huge piece of property, and that tree, which looked dead to me. I don't know why, it didn't look like a very ideal piece of real estate for a bear, but apparently it was perfect for her. They said that it was kind of an ideal spot, and that's where we found her living that day.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention in A Pup Called Trouble, because as I said, so much of the research that I did on the 3 different critters in the book, the coyote, crow, and possum, is based on fact. There is a section at the end called Critter Notes, and there's all kinds of information, fascinating facts about coyotes, crows, and possums, hopefully things that people don't know about that will amaze them and give them a better appreciation for these wild neighbors that we share this beautiful space with.
Yeah, I think it's such a unprecedented time that we're living in, but there are also if we're outside more, I mean, it's certainly summertime, there are things that we can be doing actively outside, exploring, learning about our natural world, looking more closely at things that we tend to pass by in the hustle and bustle of everyday life, whether it's plant life or animals, even the weather. I'm a big weather nerd too, so
I am too.
Bobbie, we've got to talk more. You and I have way more in common than we ever get to talk about. It's so funny. We spend all this time together in our writer group, but we don't ever really get to chat like this. But I think too, I wanted to say, you were showing your critter notes at the back of your book. If any of y'all are listening, have young ones at home, or folks who do, and you need things to do, I would encourage you to look at publishers' websites. They often have downloadable resources that even if you don't have the book at home, you could still use. My publisher of this book is Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And on my website and on the publisher's website, there's a link to download a study. It's called a study guide, which, I mean, I don't know, many kids are like, yeah, let's do this study guide about that fun book we just read. But it's also I would say it's more of a, blueprint to adventure. That might be what I would call it, because it's a way to take the book and kind of dive into some of the science and then think about, what those animals or similar animals or any animals you've got in your backyard, how they might be behaving. And are you noticing their behavior changing because there are just less people out and about in the world right now?
Right.
Which I think is really fascinating. So definitely check publishers for resources and things that are free that you can download and use at home in case kiddos are going to be at home again when the school year cranks up. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
You guys, so much great information. Thank you so much.
This is great.
We have just a couple minutes left. So I just want to remind participants that if you look in the chat, you can see links to places where you can buy these authors' books at Malaprops. There's also, Stephanie posted some links to Bearwise, that great program that Amy told us about that is local for NC, right? Is that right?
It's actually all over the Southeast.
Oh, Southeast, okay. And then Candid Critters, which is NC, and that sounds amazing. And then iNaturalist, which I am actually gonna check out immediately after I get off this meeting, because that sounds really cool. I had never heard of that before. And we are also nature geeks over at our house. So, all right, anything more you guys want to add before we sign off? And or any last questions?
I just want to thank Malaprops so much for hosting this and kind of coming up with the idea. Goldleaf Literary. This is this has been so much fun, and but at the same time, and I think certainly the people at Malaprops and JoAnne and Amy as authors, this has been such a challenging time for all of us. And just to be able to do something almost normal, which is talk about our books and talk about why we're passionate about them, and for me to see faces other than my husband's is so nice. So thank you so much, Malaprops, for doing this and just keeping the community spirit there. Yeah.
We're so lucky to have Malaprops. I work there. I feel really, I work there. I'm not there now, but I'm still doing some work from them from home. And I love that we're doing this. And it's so special for me to be able to participate as an author, as someone who works there, because those folks are like my family. So whenever we get together for an event, I kind of feel like I'm in my living room. Of course, now I'm actually in an actual personal room in my home, but it feels that way when I'm in the store too. So I agree. This was great.
Yeah, and this is the upside of not being able. Well, you can do curbside pickup, and Malaprops is still very much functioning, but not having in-person author events is that this is very flexible. This has been recorded, and Malaprops will post it later, so you can refer back to it anytime if you want to go onto Malaprops' site. They have a link to their YouTube channel, so you can find the links to these authors, and also just like if you know someone who would enjoy this and didn't get to participate, they can do it later. So
yeah, that's great.
It's wonderful.
Well, this was a really great and diversionary conversation, and I think we all appreciate it. And there's something that, as much as things that are going on with humans in the world, our wild neighbors, as you called them, are always going to be there, and they're always fascinating. And yeah, and they are just a wonderful part of our world that it's nice to focus on the positive things that we can learn about animals.
Right. Turn your TV off and go outside.
That's right. That's right.
And Amy, do you want to leave us with one last thought? What was it? Life always finds a way?
Life finds a way. Jeff Goldblum, Jurassic Park. It really does. Yeah.
That's a good takeaway.
Quotable Jeff Goldblum. That's
as ever. That's
Okay. Any other last takeaways, ladies?
No,
That's a good one to end on.
Get outside.
Get outside.
Love it. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We appreciate your coming.
Thank you. Bye.